number one factor of whether people save, how much, and how.
That's
right?
a massive innovation of culture. That's huge.
Yeah. Are you reaching the people outside of your field of vision? And when you're not, you're limited your ability to grow.
Making decisions around life and death for your kids.
I need you to promise me you will have my back.
Listen, in the first quarter, I'll promise you I'll bring 19 patients. In the first quarter, we brought...
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Disrupt the Podcast with Andres Tapia,
and Eloisa Domingo,
where we challenge conventional thinking and we look at the things that are shaping our future.
A few episodes back, we talked about disruption of ourselves. And the way that Andres and I talked about that is within the context of leaving an organization. And then we sat and realized, you can actually be a disruptor by still staying, of course, within your organization, but disrupting the organization itself. And so that's what we're actually going to talk about today.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, most of our viewers, are within organizations, and who knows if they're going to ever leave their organizations,
Right.
or if
Or
they
want
might be
to leave their
want to, or they might be
organization.
several years from that. But you can do change and innovation and disruption right where you are. So we want to go back to, even though we had talked about how our wings were somewhat clipped or limited, and how much we could disrupt, we could still, and we still did. And that we want to share those stories in ways that you can think about where you're at, whatever your role is, and see where you can sort of bring a change where it needs to change.
Yeah, and I'm excited about that, actually, Andres, because for our viewers, you're going to learn about some stories. I'm going to learn some stories about Andres.
Same here. How about
Yeah,
you?
and we're going to kind of do this interview, kind of thing. But what we're going to do first is we're going to introduce this concept of culture innovation.
Yeah, which is a concept
Andres.
you came up with in your work as a disruptor inside organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me talk with you just a little bit about it, and then you're going to kind of see it manifest, I think, in some of the stories that we're going to share and talk about today. So this idea of culture innovation, for me at least, you know that the work that I've done for a very long time typically is housed inside of kind of an HR, department. For me, I'm not an HR professional. I wasn't born and raised in HR. And so as I was doing the work for a lot of my former organizations, I was trying to figure out how we were actually making our organizations more inclusive for the market, how we are making our products more diverse and more, again, inclusive and attractive for people that maybe we weren't serving in the past, the organizations weren't serving in the past. But that by doing that, we were improving the brand and growing profit, or even saving money. And in the process of doing that, Andres, I found that by creating products that were more inclusive of market, going places where the organization had not gone before, it actually changed the culture of the organization. So it almost was kind of like a backwards in to creating a more inclusive, workplace culture. So that's what I call culture innovation, creating innovation for your market. And as a result of that, your market comes, you build it and they will come, but then your culture becomes much more innovative and much more inclusive. So when I say something like that, Andres, I would love to hear when you think back about your amazing and illustrious career, I'd love to hear maybe some examples, or maybe an example and a story you could tell us about that.
Yeah, and I think you have several, I have several, and I think we're going to keep working our way through it too, because we're going to show how it can apply in a variety of different ways.
Yep.
And even though this culture innovation is something that you came up with and you've been using for several years, as you've been sharing that concept with me, I realized, I'm in a culture innovator too.
Yeah.
Just didn't use that term, but now I do.
Yeah.
Right? Now I'm a culture innovator too. I have been. But let me give you an example. Actually, when I was the first ever Chief Diversity Officer at Hewitt, which was a human resources consulting firm that then got bought out by Aon, and sort of it's, you may not know about that organization anymore, but it was a global, far-reaching organization that did consulting on all things talent, meaning not only talent management, but also health management, retirement financial management, and HR outsourcing.
Okay, wow.
And this is very important. And let me lay it out to be able to understand the culture innovation application. So being the first ever Chief Diversity Officer, it was assumed that I would do some of the classic D&I things of affinity groups, diversity training, pipeline development. And of course, that was part of it. But from the very beginning, I felt that, sure, we can do all that and have a more inclusive, engaged, psychologically safe environment, work toward more diversity across the board. But I leaned back, very much like the stories you're going to tell, and say, okay, that's all fine and good, but for the purpose of what? Within this organization, whether in your case, healthcare, in my case, in this first example, and then I'll tell some client stories. It was human resource, talent, leadership, and culture consultancy. What difference will it make that the organization is more diverse and inclusive? For the purpose, the financial purpose, and what clients were looking to Hewitt to look at. And
Great
so
point.
I had my first meeting with the executives, and they all walked in. And I was a brand new minted diversity executive.
Yeah.
And I started by saying, on your chairs, there's a printed out deck. And back then we printed out decks more than we do now. But,
Right.
there we were. And I said, and it had all the sort of best practices on that you would expect in a D&I strategy. That was more internal. I said, that's the presentation I'm not going to talk about. We'll talk about it later.
That's a great first move.
But I said, what I want to talk about is health management and retirement financial management and HR outsourcing, because that's the core businesses of this organization.
Yeah.
And my question, I'm wondering, executives, how are we taking into account the diversity of our clients' workforces in the management of health and retirement savings and even HR outsourcing? How are we? And they go, like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I bet.
That's about health. That's about money. What does that have to do with diversity? I said, well, I was stroking my chin here a little bit, and I go, I was wondering, right? Because health management, just so you understand, is about helping companies have the right healthcare coverage for their employees in ways that not only protect their employees, but is cost effective.
Yeah.
And in terms of retirement financial management, is to have savings plans in the United States, 401k, and nonprofits. There's other vehicles for that. But the idea is to match the savings that the employees do so they can have health protection. So if we're doing that, and the workforce is diverse, how are we addressing the fact that maybe perhaps people with different ethnic, racial, cultural, national backgrounds, or different gender or sexual orientation, may they possibly, as a population segment, have different attitudes toward fundamental things like health and wealth? And they all kind of looked at me like, what are you talking about? And so I said, well, let me try this on for size as a hypothesis. Then let's talk about retirement. Retirement is often termed as long-term savings. But as a cultural innovator, the question is, what does long-term mean? Because for U.S. Americans, middle class, tended to be more European American, the cultural default, and the sociologists would tell you that, is that the future is the next generation. But in many Asian cultures, not all, but in many, long-term is the next century.
Yeah.
And for Latino cultures like mine, the future is the next 3 to 5 years. So what does long-term mean? That is a fundamental cultural understanding, right? So might that mindset affect whether they save in their 401k or not, or whatever retirement plan they have?
Yeah.
Can we find out? And I was able to convince them to do a study. And the study was the following. We got 55 Fortune 500 companies to participate. It was like an employee base of 2 million, all the way from security guard to CEO. And we had all the data of behavior. They offer 401k plan or whatever the equivalent was. And we asked for the various things. Do they use it? At what percentage? Do you have a withdrawal or loan after your 401k, right? And what was the balance you started with? And we did a regression analysis. And we looked at race and ethnicity, gender, tenure, and age. And the question was, which is the most influential factor in whether people save how much and how? So all the actuaries in the executive team, which was a bunch of actuaries, by the way, and financial people, they put their bet on income. More income.
I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the regression analysis come back, And then the number one factor of whether people save how much and how was race and ethnicity.
Wow.
And the question was why. And so Black, African American, Latino, less likely to participate. If they did, at a lower rate.
Yep.
They tend to be more conservative,
Yep.
more bonds versus
Yep.
equities.
Yep.
And tended to have more withdrawals and loans after
Yeah.
401k.
Yeah. That totally makes sense.
Undermining the very wealth-creating mechanisms
Yep.
to build compound
Long-term,
and
yeah.
long-term.
Wealth. Yeah.
And as we pulled on the thread, well, why is that? Well, if you have a short-term time horizon,
Yeah. Right.
and Latinos often say, well, mañana will take care of itself, Dios quiere, God willing,
Right.
don't worry about it. What matters is today.
Right.
The many times, if they participated, it was seen as a short-term savings plan that help pay for my daughter's quinceañera.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so this was a revolution because if Hewitt was in the business of helping organizations help protect their employees, and they weren't being cultural innovators and taking
Right.
into account the different mindsets, beliefs, behaviors,
Right.
conditions, right?
That influence those decisions.
That influence those
Yeah.
decisions, then the design of the program,
Absolutely.
the communication was off.
That's right. That's right. You know what I think is also interesting too is I'm going to go back. I want to talk about this product, but or the shift in thinking. How did you feel when you were in that room and the executives were like, kind of looking at you, kind of like dumbfounded? How
Well,
did
right, because I think a cultural innovator has to really challenge the status quo, because what you have done by putting that term on it and what you and I have done by leaning into that concept is that we're actually allowing for differentiation to happen in thinking about a large scale population, right? And the problem by not questioning the cultural presuppositions is assuming that the workforce, in this case the workforce, is going to behave more monolithically.
Yeah.
And so the answers about how to motivate people to save and do in a way that doesn't undermine whatever they are saving is that motivation is pretty much true for everybody.
Right.
And it's actually, no, it's true for the majority group,
That's right.
but it might be missing the mark.
That's right. That's right. So it sounds to me like you convinced them. Am I making this the right assumption? I mean, given the research.
Let me tell you.
Yeah.
So one of the clinchers was that, first of all, they were, when you say, well, how did they react? They were skeptical.
I'm sure. It
But
sounds like it.
When the CEO had asked me to be the first ever chief diversity officer, I said, I'll do it. But looking me in the eyes, I said to him, I need you to promise me you will have my back.
Yeah, great.
Because I'm going to test and probe and question. And as long as you back me up, then we'll go. So he backed me up. He was one of those, I don't get it, but I said, well, you promise you have my back.
So this is actually really good. And I want you to continue with that story, but I want to point this out for our listeners, because to me, I don't think that Andres and I, now I'm probably going to speak for both of us here, I don't think that Andres and I will ever coach you or give you stories that talk about disruption without some sort of like calibration or strategy. To me, you already knew that you were a disruptor, whether or not you were using that word, but that you set yourself up for success by couching it and saying, all right, look, I'll take the job.
If
Right.
you have my back. So early on, I needed him to have my back.
That's right.
So he looked at me and like, I don't get it. He looked at everybody else, but let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go. So now it was a hunch, it was a hypothesis, but now we went to a true research mode.
Right.
And it was a true regression analysis.
Wow.
And the data was there, and they looked at it and they could not deny it.
Yeah.
But once they saw the data, they still didn't understand, why does the data come out that way? And this is where culture innovators come in, because they say, okay, here's what we know about cultures.
Yep.
So I give you the example, right? That different demographic groups have different views of the future, and when is the future going to happen, right?
That's right.
And so that was one dynamic, and so how do you solve the problem? And it's not, in this example of retirement, it wasn't just that one example about what is long-term mean, but also is what is your sense of self? And Latino cultures and Filipino cultures, which is very Latino influence, tend to be more communal. The sense of self comes from who you belong to.
Yeah.
And the more individualistic cultures, with some European American cultures, especially in the U.S. and middle class, tend to be more individualistic. Not a judgment, but just a sense of self comes more from the individual.
Yep.
So what's the implications of that for saving for long term?
Yeah.
So tell me, Elisa,
true.
what is a typical 401k brochure, retirement brochure? What's the image that tends to be on the brochure?
Oh, it tends to be the person and the partner who look older, and it's like kind of this very stereotypical, they might be on a boat with a big house and like, kind of like the horizon.
Exactly. Oh,
Yeah.
there might be
Yeah.
a Labrador next to them,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Right?
A very relaxed, upper middle class.
Yeah.
Very put together, but relaxed.
Yeah,
I'm
cool.
comfortable.
Chill.
Yeah.
So, and that is the selling point,
That
right?
is.
I mean, and we know marketing, and you're trying to go to a view, picture a view of the world that you know that couple is going to have, and they want to aspire to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you have a 25-year-old Latino
Yeah.
who has to send $50 a week with remittances to
Yeah,
Guadalajara,
home.
Mexico, and you're encouraging to put aside some of their income
Yeah.
for something that they're not going to see for another 40 years.
Yeah. It doesn't.
Right?
Yeah.
While mama is waiting for her remittances in Guadalajara, Mexico.
Yeah.
So go back to the image. How do you think someone from a communal culture, whether it's Latino, Filipino, or some
Yeah.
other community,
Yeah.
how might they react
Yeah.
to that couple on the beach with a Labrador next to them?
I mean, that's really self-centered. I mean, where is Lola? Where is grandma? Where is Tita? Where is the family? I mean, so I'm on a boat somewhere with a dog.
Right.
That's it's disrespectful. I have completely it's actually shameful in our cultures. Even for me, I'm like, how dare you?
Well, exactly. And it's like, pobrecitos are all alone. Poor them. No wonder they need the dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Right. So
Great point.
and so then when I would do the slideshow and I would show them and they go, oh, yeah, that's the image we have.
Yeah, sure,
And then
but-
I go through the thing about, well, how would somebody from a different culture view that?
Yeah.
And they start to see it as lonely and forgotten and selfish.
Yeah.
But what if you put a picture of that couple surrounded by 3 generations of the family and say, is that the lifestyle you want in
Yeah.
the future, right?
I love it.
So that's just one of many examples,
Yeah.
right? That being a cultural innovator allows us to ask new questions, have new
love that.
hypotheses. And we found over and over again, whether
Yeah.
it was on retirement, financial management, or on health management,
Yeah.
that we surfaced these differences and allowed us to then challenge us to design different solutions in a
Yeah.
different way,
Yeah.
right? And market and communicate.
I
So
love
that's
that.
one story, but I
Yeah,
know you have
yeah,
others. And so
yeah.
here, I want to lean back now
Yeah.
and have you tell a detailed story about where you were a culture innovator and
Yeah.
where you had been.
Yeah, yeah. I'll start with Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. So I was there as a consultant, not a consultant as in like a vendor, but we called our HR consulting group HR Consulting. I was under the diversity group at the time, and we were housed in HR. And I was seeing that we had a lot of kiddos from Kuwait who are coming in for what's called lavages. So lavages are where you have excessive liquid or water on the lungs. It actually is a very easy procedure. Lavages, you just kind of go in and you suck out the extra liquid off the lungs so that you can actually expand your lungs and breathe. What we were finding is that for whatever reason, I don't know exactly this, but we had a lot of kiddos from Kuwait. Many of them were from Bedouin families. Bedouin means that they are in the deserts. It was not uncommon for them to have to get on a camel to go to healthcare in Kuwait. And then as a result of that, they had to go find somebody who could do lavages, which again tends to be an outpatient procedure, could be an inpatient procedure. So here you are having all of these kiddos, but we didn't have anybody in Kuwait doing that. We also had a very large amount of kiddos. Again, so Cincinnati Children's is one of the top pediatric centers in the world. We had a lot of kiddos with hematology, oncology, so cancer issues. For those of you who don't know, if you are an international patient coming to the United States, you pay through your embassies, and the embassies pay up front. So if my care is going to be $4,000, of course, in the United States, if you have insurance, you pay for that either via your insurance. You don't have to pay for it up front. The embassies will pay in cash, $4,000, $7,000, whatever. So Cincinnati Children's has all of that money up front. And it actually, it is non-refundable, so you don't get it back. That's a massive financial gain if you can also help the patients in the long run. So what I said to them is, I said, how, we have all these Arab patients, these Arab and Arabic speaking patients, by the way, who were 100% Muslim, all of them practiced Islam. And they were coming, and we were kind of just sending them back to the Arab Gulf states. So two things. Number one, why are we taking these Bedouin kids, putting them on a camel, taking them here when this is a very simple procedure? We ended up having a partnership. I pitched a partnership with some Kuwaiti hospitals and universities to train doctors and nurses on how to do lavages. And so they have their own center over there, which is actually a partnership with Cincinnati Children. So that's number one. But then number two, I really like building things for companies, actually building brick and mortar, things. One of my first things was the Asian Culture Center at Indiana University. So I like being able to touch, things that I build. And so I was put on a team to build the International Patient Care Center at Cincinnati Children's, specifically for hematology, oncology, pediatric patients there. Now, here's the thing. Those kiddos were actually the most acutely sick kids in Cincinnati, drawing us to be the number one most acute pediatric center in the country, which means that we had the sickest hematology and oncology kids in the country. We influxed about 220 patients within a 6-month period. That's a huge amount of patients all of a sudden. So here's why that was a big deal. Cincinnati did not have an Arab community. So here we are, having some of the most sick kids in the world coming to Cincinnati that didn't have an Arab community in Cincinnati. So think about that. You've got a sick kid, what are you going to think about? So not just the hospital, but then once your kid comes home, you have to be able to call 911 if the kid becomes septic, if the kid gets sick, whatever. 911 didn't have interpreter services or people who spoke Arabic. There are 47 dialects of Arabic. None of them were spoken. So you got a really sick kid. If you have sepsis, you can die within 6 hours. You have to get somebody who can speak your language and get somebody there. Number one, so fire, any type of rescue things. We didn't have enough people who were speaking Arabic and people from Arab backgrounds who were taking these families in. These families on average stayed with us for a year and 4 months. That was the average stay because these kids were very sick. They would move their entire families here. Cincinnati was not prepared for this. And so the point is seeing, first of all, an opportunity to say, well, wait a second, these are front paying families, embassies. So that was, a massive business case. But we also wanted to be more hemispheric or more global. And so we can also help academically to build, kind of lavage based support in other countries, particularly, Kuwait. But then we had really, really sick kids in the Arab Gulf. And where are they going? How could we help save lives? Why don't we bring them here? But again, bringing them here meant changing the entire city, changing the entire 911, fire and police rescue, changing real estate, changing the schools, changing everything. And so the reason how I talk about culture innovation, again, is from the outside in. Oftentimes, when we talk about changing workplaces, Andres, it's about changing from the inside out.
That's right.
And that's what culture innovation is about. When you brought up that example of Hewitt, you weren't talking about anything from the inside. You already had the products. You were talking about how are we getting them out there and marketing them better and getting people to actually buy and feel loyal, to our products. It's the exact same thing at Cincinnati Children's. And so we started from the outside in. And long story short, after we started bringing those patients in, the culture really inside of Cincinnati Children's, first of all, note that this was between 2010 and 2016-ish, when the fever around Arab people in burqas, in hijabs, with long beards, that wasn't always a positive thing then. I mean, it's not, we've always been handling these things, but then there was a huge fever. So all of a sudden in Cincinnati that didn't have that population, we were bringing 224 kids that each on average would bring 5 to 20 people with
which
them.
is a sort of communal
Exactly.
culture thing as well, right?
Exactly. And then so all of a sudden, and all of them spoke Arabic. All of them looked a certain way. All of them, halal meat was not available, by the way, in Cincinnati and large, so
Halal meat being
halal meat, and oh my gosh, you might have to help me, with this. I haven't been exposed to this in so long. Halal is a way in which the meat is prepared. Am I correct? And so it was really interesting how then it was a culture shock to Cincinnati Children's. Our doctors and nurses were very uncomfortable, around this look. They were uncomfortable because oftentimes, so 80% of women at the time were the number one decision makers for family. Right now, I think it's closer to about 87%, of women who are making the decisions, healthcare decisions for families. At that time, it was about 80. So of course, as a healthcare worker, the people would face the women, and the women would back off. Women don't make decisions in most of those cultures, and so it was a total kind of shift.
Everything was different.
Everything was different. But by creating this innovation, and by reteaching the culture how to shift to this innovative influx of sick kiddos that were actually bringing in, again, and this might be unromantic for some people, but there was a shift in finance as well. There was a profit gain, here. The culture shifted, but we helped them as well. There was a lot of training. There was a lot of tools that we redid. So that's also what culture innovation is about, bringing it from the outside in.
So, but you said that, I want to go back to, you say we had to change the whole 911 thing and language, but how did you resolve that?
Yeah, so we talked with the 911 service centers. You may not know, but 911 is actually a vendor service that is then vendor to places like the police and, things like that. At least that's how it was in Cincinnati. So we talked with them and we said, do you have anybody here that speaks Arabic? In general, no. Okay, so what we would do is we would have them borrow our interpreter services at Cincinnati Children's. So they would have phone interpreters, iPad interpreters. It was really, they just needed, phone interpreters. But over time, it would actually save them money to hire people who spoke Arabic. And so, and language is a skill. Language is certainly, something that you can do, but language is seen as a skill and as a differentiator. So they would start hiring 911 operators who spoke Arabic because we had very sick kids. So yeah, over time, it was not just the interpreter services, but it was also the hiring of these individuals with those language skills.
And how did you get past some of the prejudices that you were saying about how people look and all that stuff, and even who to talk to, the male or the female in the family?
A lot of it was just education, training.
But what was the response to you then? Because you're bringing up something from the outside to the middle, as opposed to from the center to out.
Yeah.
How did you influence that?
You know what was interesting, Andres? One of we would always hit on commonalities. I feel like oftentimes in the work that you and I have done, we emphasize difference. And that's where some of the discomfort comes in. But a lot of the work that we did at Cincinnati Children's was to emphasize the commonalities. Kids, families, making decisions around life and death for your kids and for whatever a family unit was to you. And so that's what was the commonality, and that's how we kind of broke down barriers. And when we talked about it like that, it was like, it was like, well, for you, it might be who makes the decisions in your family. And it was interesting because people would be like, oh, well, grandfather. And it's like, your grandfather? I mean, that's interesting. It's like, yeah, because you don't know, like grandpa's going to come up here. It's like, right. So this family, this is how they make decisions, and this culture. So we would try to find commonalities and kind of grow from there.
So you brought it up, you surfaced it outside in, you're doing education, but what were the results?
Yes. So Cincinnati Children's at the time then became one of the top oncology pediatric centers in the country, serving those particular, diagnoses, hematology, oncology, lavage, kiddos. And so that alone, that profit shift, was large. Internationally also, our brand changed to be able to say that, wow, you actually support across, spaces. And again, like we said, Andres, looking at those families, Arab families, again, with the burqas and the, this, that was scary for a lot of places. Some places actually chose not to, pursue that because of that look, that influx of those patients, because certainly at Cincinnati Children's, when those patients would walk in and sit in lobbies, we would definitely have other patients move or say, why are they and get mad. Like, why are they going in before me? We had a lot of that. And so there were a lot of things that we just had to figure out, along the way. So shift in brand, shift in reputation, shift in profit, shift in really, the education and the cultural competency of our base. Outcomes actually, which was great. Lavages, we never. You never want to say that you don't have market anymore, but it was actually positive for us. We didn't have a lot of kids coming over to get lavages because we trained the doctors there to do it. That was the point. We don't need them to come over on a massive 26-hour flight to come over for a very simple, procedure. That's actually a positive thing. Another thing, actually, we dropped sepsis rates because we were able to have 911 operators that were speaking the language or had interpreters. The sepsis rates dropped, morbidity rates dropped. Inpatient rates dropped because you don't have to keep the kiddos inside the hospitals. They can actually go home. So it was a lot of things like that.
This is the kind of disruption that actually saved lives.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I agree. And, I thank you, first of all, Andres, for allowing me to share that, because that's a really, for me as a mom and, having kids, thank goodness none of them are sick. That's a really significant example for me to always share. And I would love to hear, again, another example for you, anything that was significant, for you in the past.
Let's go to something completely different.
Yes, let's do it.
I was invited to Ford Motor Company, and they have had a long history of caring about diversity and inclusion, but they wanted to up their game in this space. And they invited me, and I in the iconic Thunderbird room. It's a big circular table with only a narrow, I don't know if it was wood or marble, but and then in the middle is just a big opening, right? That's cool. All the executives around. And kind of similar to my opening with the Hewitt executives, I know you invited me to talk about diversity inclusion, and you're assuming we're going to talk about talent. And we'll get to that. But I want to talk about cars and trucks. Because that's the business that you're in. And just to pick it, for instance, with a community that I'm familiar with, how are you doing with selling cars and trucks to the Latinos in the United States? Mm-hmm. And I remember all the looks around the table went around and kind of put their heads down and not that great. And I said, well, I had a hunch, but I know how your competitors are doing. One out of every four Toyota Corolla are bought by Latinos. 60% of all Honda sales are to Latinos. So the question is, if that's what your competition is doing, talking about diversity should be also about the core of your business. Mm-hmm. And to Ford's credit, they took it to heart. And a year later, they put in an RFP for training on cross-cultural. They didn't use culture innovator, but that was what it was. Yeah. For 100 dealerships in heavy Latino populations.
That's great.
And the assumption wasn't that you needed to be Latino to sell to Latinos.
No, yeah.
But the assumption was you need to have a diverse workforce where people could see people like them.
Yeah.
But also assumption that anybody from any background with some cultural intelligence and cultural innovative mindset could be able to better understand that different people with different demographics might have different motivators or need to see different things in order to purchase a car or truck. And to this day, Ford then fast forwarded, and to this day, that Ford F-150 is their best-selling truck to the Latino population by a long shot. Yeah. It's part of Latino culture.
That's amazing.
And think about where they were just a few years ago. So it requires, and that was innovation, that was culture innovation, that was disruptive thinking, right? And that was about thinking about diversity from the perspective of what's important to this organization. In this case, they exist to sell cars and trucks. Yeah. So good for them that they wanted a more diverse workforce, but for the purpose of what?
Right.
And the purpose is, get the best talent, but also tap into that talent to be able to better see, to use your term, the margins that they were overlooking. Yeah. And start trying to, because they could not see that market from the center.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, and that's also what culture innovation is about. Like you said, that it was this idea that there was a market out there that they were. I mean, it sounds to me like Ford at that time was tapping into that market, but like, I can see them kind of when you ask that question, putting their heads down because they realized that they weren't really optimizing. On
no,
that
but
market.
I would say I don't think they were. I don't think they were conscious.
Yeah,
That the
yeah.
market was out there. I think
Yeah.
that was the story.
Yeah.
Right? Their competitors were tuned in. They were
Wow.
not. But
Yeah.
once they tuned in,
Yeah.
they really
Shifted.
shifted and made it a strategic priority,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And sure, there's a diversity component to it, but they made it a strategic priority for the sake of growing the business,
Yeah.
which is really what organizations for profit do.
Want to do what I love about that example actually, which is also different from your Hewitt example, is that it wasn't just about. I think any organization can kind of create a marketing new marketing plan or a new communications plan and then draw in a market, but what it sounds like for Ford is they actually fundamentally shifted.
Sure.
I mean, there were talent pools, there were community spaces that they had to go into. I mean, that's
They had to do training for 100 dealerships.
That's a really different, that you
and the
said
training wasn't just 2-hour thing. I mean,
Yeah.
it was like a curriculum.
That's
right?
a massive innovation of culture. That's huge.
Yeah, and it paid off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now talk about it changes the Ford culture, but the Ford culture changed the certain Latino community cultures because that is a status symbol in certain
That's cool.
Latino communities, and it's a sense of having arrived, and it's a workhorse truck.
Yes, it is.
That
It
really
is.
gets the work done, but it's a
Wow.
beautiful truck.
It is.
And they found a way to really reach the Latino mindset, and that's a
Wow.
whole other story. There's a marketing that it wasn't just done in Spanish, but Spanglish and even in English.
That's cool.
But and not only who they showed,
Yeah.
but the context in which they showed them.
Yeah.
Kind of back
Yeah.
to my Hewitt story, right? It wasn't just about the lone, more cowboy guy. This
Yeah.
is called guy
Yeah.
in this pickup truck.
Yeah.
But there was images of families as part surrounding
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
culture of that truck.
Yeah. You know what I love too? You this idea, so as you and I talked about, a lot of the work that you and I have done, intrinsically the work of DEI has always been inside of HR, and so you and I are like, yep, we can do that. We can pull talent, we can hire new talent, we can do whatever. But you and I are kind of twisting it in the examples that we're giving. And here, hiring diverse talent in some of those roles was also something. I mean, that's also a checkbox. It wasn't the checkbox, but it was something that was kind of like a byproduct of the way that Ford rethought.
Well, and let's lean into what's happening in this environment. In many ways, D&I has been critiqued and sort of diminished, and and I think we can talk about motivations, but for now, I just looked at a bay. One of the vulnerabilities the D&I faced is that it wasn't, especially in for-profit organizations, not grounded enough in the so what.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so
I agree.
we need a more diverse workforce, but
No,
for what?
For what? Yeah.
I mean, it's a right
100%.
thing to do. Some of us,
That's
like
right.
you would say,
100%.
But in the end, if in the corporation, which has a poor profit, that we
Yep.
got to sell more cars of trucks,
Yep,
so we have
100%.
to, as much as for the healthcare organizations you talked about was about saving lives, but also there's a revenue producing part of it.
Yep.
Or in the Hewitt example about really being able to deliver the promises to clients so they can better serve their populations,
Yep.
and therefore they're paying Hewitt to be a good consultant to do that.
Yeah.
These organizations were not delivering on their promises.
Yeah.
And so where, diversity sort of holds itself as something that is not vulnerable to some of the attacks is when it was positioned and continues to be positioned as relevant to innovation, relevant to growing new market,
Yeah. Profit.
relevant to customer service that can be tailored to the different populations that are out there.
Yeah, I agree. One thing that you and I talk a lot about, Andres, is this idea of risk. And it sounds to me as well, this idea that, I think some organizations have seen DEI as a portion of like, well, I don't really get it, so it might be risky to me. But when you tie DEI to these kinds of things, you actually answer the so what, it becomes much more clear.
Well, and let's say it this way. It's risky not to.
That's right.
If you are a for-profit organization trying to sell more cars or trucks or more rooms in a hotel, right, or more seats on a cruise line, right, and you're not reaching the full market,
Right.
to not think, whether you call it D&I or not, we don't care.
It doesn't really matter.
But it's like are you reaching the people outside of your field of vision? And when you're not, you're limited your ability to grow.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And actually makes me think, too, because I want to hear another story from you.
Yeah.
And it's a transgender one.
That's right.
Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so I was the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer at Johns Hopkins Medicine, which is in Baltimore. And at the time, I actually was working with doctors and nurses. And so I was outside of HR and training how to be, our number one thing was we provide world-class medical care. And we save lives. So that's what Johns Hopkins does and did. And so I was lucky, to be out there. I also worked in the ED, so the emergency department, and we found that one of the number one growing populations in the emergency department were transgender patients, transgender women who identified as Black or African American. So Black and African American transgender women were being targeted, mostly gunshots, and additionally stabbings in Baltimore as the number one murder population. If they didn't die, they would come to our trauma bay and we would save them. And then we would send them off. So I kept thinking, so they're coming here and we're saving their lives, but what else are we doing for them? Are we able to provide for them, OB-GYN care, dental care, kind of holistic care. And we weren't. For many people who don't know, Johns Hopkins at that time had a over 40-year history of being very transphobic, writing or supporting, things within the DSM-4 and DSM-5 around.
Which is what?
It is the DSM-4 and DSM-5 are documents that help psychology and behavioral psychologists, clinicians indicate what mental health conditions and diseases exist. And so at the time, it was very much like transgender individuals had a mental disability. This was not really real. This really, and transgender people therefore also didn't need rights or deserve rights because there was just something wrong going on in their heads. Hopkins was one of actually the leading providers in the world that pushed that very transphobic kind of belief. And because the brand of Johns Hopkins is so prolific, of course people believe them. And of course people followed, that rhetoric and that theory. But yet here we are, during that time, and transgender Black women were being targeted and murdered. And I thought, well, we're saving their lives, but they're going where? To the University of Maryland, Baltimore County to get dental care and to get, endocrinology and support for, their affirming gender care needs. And I said, well, I don't understand. And I did some research and I found that most transgender individuals, when they go through gender affirming care, many insurance companies don't cover that. So they're paying out of pocket there's a lot of money, that again, I'm going back to money. A lot of people think that, the work of diversity or inclusion or equity or belonging, it's really unromantic when you talk about money. But again, it goes back to what you and I talked about. But then what's the so what? I mean, how are you tying it, especially for for-profit companies?
And in providing quality services.
Absolutely.
There's a point, right? There's
course.
a revenue part, but there's are we saving lives? Are we improving healthcare conditions for people?
Absolutely. And Johns Hopkins, being an academic medical center, we were also pursuing, continuing to be the best in medical care. So are you really being the best? Especially Johns Hopkins and many institutions like Ford in Detroit, we were what's considered an anchor institution. So anchor institutions are these institutions within cities or villages or towns that provide a lot of jobs for the community. Hopkins is an anchor institution in Baltimore, but yet the community, parts of our community, were really being targeted, and we weren't supporting them in the way that a world-class institution could support them. And so, long story short, I talked with endocrinology. I talked with our endocrinologist, and I said, if we could get some of our transgender patients to come here and get hormonal care here, would you be willing, to help them? We couldn't. I was looking for holistic care, but let's just start with endocrinology. And our endocrinologist said, yeah, we don't have really anybody here who specializes in transgender affirming care, but we could probably find somebody or train somebody, and we actually found people who did that, who could specialize in that. And so slowly but surely we started, getting, patients. Then I talked with OB-GYN, same thing. And anyway, over the course of time, I figured out a general, kind of patient flow for transgender patients who would come in and get speech pathology, OB-GYN, endocrinology, surgery, those kinds of things. And we created a typical patient path. And I started talking to our leaders about creating some sort of, again, patient flow for these patients. That's all I kind of, said. And I said, well, they're getting targeted in our city. We should be a really good, citizen and help save their lives and not just work with them in the ED. And interestingly, I thought, oh, these doctors, I was raised by doctors. I thought, oh, these doctors are going to,
I was raised by a doctor.
Yeah. And I thought, oh, these doctors are going to care, because this is a pull on the heartstrings. And it was like, so I don't get it. When I started showing what the profit margins were, how transgender patients were paying out of pocket, that there was a very large flow in Baltimore. Then we also tied it to reputation. We tied it to other things. It was like, okay,
and you tied it to the competition too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we tied it to competition. We said, okay, fine, try it, Eloisa. So I lined up a bunch of, as I mentioned, endocrinology, OB-GYN, speech path, surgery. We kind of lined up a path, mental health support. We lined up the path. And I said to them, listen, in the first quarter, I'll promise you I'll bring 19 patients. In the first quarter, we brought 90 patients. And over the course of time, this is actually now the largest transgender center, affirming transgender care center on the East Coast. One of the other things too that I also knew that they didn't know is there was a major transgender care center in New York that was closing at the time. I talked to them and I said, where are your patients going to go? We actually talked to those patients and we said, if Johns Hopkins opens a center for transgender health, holistic care, what we call from pediatrics to geriatrics, would you come? And they said yes. And I said, so I knew that when that was going to close down, we were going to get their patients. Johns Hopkins didn't know that. I knew that.
It's extraordinary.
And it's strategy, right? Just like you did that with your boss. It was like, so I knew that I was going to set them up for success.
Yeah. So I think, Eloisa, as we kind of land this conversation, the idea with you viewers is we wanted to bring you into the fact that one can be an innovator, a culture innovator, and therefore a disruptor inside organizations, despite the limits that we discussed in a previous episode, because there's a place where organizations are kind of stuck because they're limited by the field of vision, but we can start asking new questions, we can start looking at data, we can start being more creative. So, Eloisa, let's summarize for our viewers, let's give them a disrupt GPS, right? What are the takeaways that you and I have come up with just in this organic conversation, right?
Mm-hmm. And one thing, Andres is introducing this concept of disrupt GPS. So all of the things in our podcast, we will provide this idea of disrupt GPS. It's not just us talking to you and giving you narratives, but it's also this idea of giving us kind of pivotal takeaways so that you can apply them in your own lives and your worlds and your work. For me, Andres, I think for me, a couple things. Number one, disruption is calculated, especially when it comes to strategy in organizations and trying to make change in organizations. For me, I was very caught by the fact that you knew intrinsically that you are a disruptor. You wanted to make change when you go into your organizations, but you also had to set up that change and that success from the get-go. So having a conversation with the CEO and saying, hey, I'm going to bring some things forward, and I need you to have my back. And to set that space up where you can bring change and transformation forward, I think is really smart. So for the disruptors out there, I do want you to think about that. There's a lot of strategy and a lot of forethought, that comes into that. So that's number one. Number two, I think for me, the other takeaway is that, oftentimes when we are in cultures, and again, Andres and I, when we talk about culture innovation, we do talk about it from the outside in. That's actually really scary because organizations don't really like that a lot. They want to make sure that the culture is either ready for the change or they're at least kind of palpable for it. What Andres and I, the examples that we gave you, we said, I don't know, we're just going to try, because we saw a gap in the market that and had trust that we could then shift the culture to accommodate for what we were
when the culture wasn't quite ready for it.
when the culture wasn't quite ready for it. And the leaders, because one thing that was also common for me and Andres is that the leaders that we pitched these to weren't ready. None of the leaders that we talked to were like,
I've been thinking about that.
Because that totally makes sense. Yeah. So for me, those are the two takeaways for me, Andres.
Well, here are a few takeaways for me. I think we've talked about disrupting ourselves and in previous conversations. And I think some of these stories have to do with the ideas and the creativity coming up from our identity or the identity of people who are really not in the center, right?
Yeah.
Who can bring them in.
Yeah.
So I think it only reinforces that let's be who we are, and in that we can see on behalf of their organizations what maybe the center organization is not seeing. So that's number one.
I love that.
I would say that in our stories, these are business stories. And so while diversity, traditional, classic, or legacy D&I practitioners led with a qualitative.
Yes.
We learned to lead with a quantitative.
Yes.
Right? And it was a quantitative that clinched it.
Yeah.
Now, once you clinched it quantitatively, the qualitative becomes sort of a nice way to enhance and dress it up, right?
100%.
But many times we lead too much with the quantitative and it doesn't convince, right?
That's right. It doesn't get the decision. I totally agree with that.
And the third one, and you kind of leaned into this, but I want to underline it because you talked about it needed to be deliberate. Mm-hmm. I think that to be a culture innovator, you have to be a leader. You had to step into spaces that others have not stepped into.
Yeah.
As we say in Spanish, se hace el camino al andar, right? You make the path as you walk it. Yeah. And I think culture innovators do that. There's no path. That's the point of disruption.
Yeah.
Right? That the pathway is already pre-charted, and we have to get off.
Yeah.
And it's not even the road less traveled.
No, it's not.
It's like where there's no road.
That's right.
Right?
That's
and I think leaders, whether you're in a functional leadership role or not, but we think that those who are disruptors are leaders because they lead to a new way. Yeah. And I think that's what our stories illustrate.
I agree. One thing that I want to bring up, and side note for the two of you, if you can find this and, whatever. So if for those of you who have ever seen, universities, for example, this is kind of where this comes from. So, when you have buildings, so, Andres might be a building, I'm a building, we've got a building, yes, over here. And so when students go to school, or to building or another on a university or college, they'll walk this path. And oftentimes what will happen is they'll have these sidewalks, But then what happens is as you build new buildings, but the sidewalks stay the same, the students will create their own paths. Mm. So what'll happen is these paths are worn into the ground, right? Because they go. So what happens is the shortest distance. It's easier for me to get there, right? Exactly. Even if it's in grass or if it's in snow or if it's whatever. So these paths are actually created by the users. And what university has actually done is leaned into that. So if you see from a top perspective, it doesn't look that aesthetically pleasing. A lot of universities say, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're doing this, because you've got all these paths, but who created it were the people that were actually using the product. And so you had to lean into that and say, oh, well, that's what they're, kind of doing. So I thought about that when you talked about it's not the road less traveled. It's actually just creating a road
new roads, right?
For yourself.
Yeah, and that's what really design that is inclusive really looks like.
That's right. That's right.
So
awesome.
Well, thanks for joining us once again in this episode where we looked at being disruptors within organizations. Despite the boundaries that organizations do, there's plenty of road and room to create new paths that do not exist. So I hope you enjoyed our stories and our examples, and we look forward to hearing what your stories are going to be.
Absolutely. And remember, look at all of the links, that we have in all of the comments here on the screen. You can check out Andres at his website, me at mine, and of course we have our joint website for the Disrupt podcast. There's a lot of ways to continue to follow us, to subscribe, and have some conversations with us on a variety of platforms. So Andres and I are so grateful to have you here with us and joining in these great disruptive conversations.
See you at the next episode.
Adios.
Ciao.